Welcome back to Indyfest 2022. I've been looking forward to this all day, and even before that, talking about a book that everybody in this room and everyone watching and others who will soon learn about it definitely need to purchase. It is an important book, and I'm thrilled to have the authors of The Big Truth here with me. Let me quickly introduce them. Major Garrett is the chief Washington correspondent for CBS News. Some of you watching may know that Major worked at the Las Vegas Review-Journal in the mid-1980s before he eventually wound up in D.C., where he's been covering national politics for about 3 decades. He's the author of several books besides this one we're going to talk about, including Mr. Trump's Wild Ride. David Becker, whom I just met recently. I've known Major way too long. He's the head of the Nonpartisan Center for Election Innovation and Research. In this capacity, he deals with election officials all across the country to ensure security and accessibility. He's also worked for the Pew Charitable Trust and for the Department of Justice, where he worked in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division. Gentlemen, I've said it before, and I want people to get a sense of what we're talking about today. This book is a monumental achievement, and I think people do not realize it because if you haven't read it, you don't see what you've done here. And you've done 3 distinct things. You present a hypothetical, frightening kind of what-if scenarios for different elections past and ones to come. You deconstruct with reporting, meticulous reporting, almost every aspect of the big lie, and I haven't seen it put together anywhere else. And then you propose possible solutions, you know, the light into this darkness. But this book really, it's a cri de coeur. It's passion saying essentially we are close to a precipice in American democracy. So I congratulate you for scaring the hell out of me. So a few general questions before we get into details of the book. Major, I'm really curious, what prompted you to write this? Was it a series of events? Did you wake up in the middle of the night with an epiphany? What made you decide you had to write this book?
So in the 2020 election, it was a completely different experience for me as someone who started covering presidential campaigns in 1992. The 2020 campaign was essentially covered by reporters watching things on Zoom or watching things on television. Essentially, they were covering it from their couch. They weren't traveling all over the country because there were almost no public events. There was no traditional barnstorming aspect of the campaign. That became very clear to me in the summer of 2020, and it occurred to me, and this is a minor epiphany, that one of the most important aspects of the 2020 election, in addition to who won, would be the procedures on which the country adapted to voting in the teeth of this global pandemic. And let's just remind ourselves for a second. When we conducted this election, we had no vaccines, social distancing, and very crude distancing and mitigation strategies. Well, voting, by its very nature, if you work on the process of putting precincts together or assembling votes and counting them, is an in-person exercise, so it had risk. Lots of poll workers opted out because they were afraid of that risk. And if you vote in person, it's a socially non-distant exercise. So I thought, this is going to be a very big part of this American story. And the election is held, and even before, former President Trump is saying the only way he can lose if it's rigged, which struck me as not only highly unusual, but very much injurious to our democracy. And then we had the election. And it occurred to me, wow, this thing was kind of an amazing event. Not the result, but how we put it together. All the adaptations, all the ways in which we allowed the highest turnout in this country, the most diverse electorate ever, to do this safely without any actual day of or day before voting or days before voting rancor or confusion. I thought this is an amazing achievement. And yet it's being slandered over and over and over again. And depending on the polling data, a third of the country believes some sort of crime was committed. And I thought, that simply can't stand. That dichotomy has to be confronted. And so I went to David, I said, do you think we could do something in this space to assert what actually happened and hold up for public review, and we hope praise and appreciation, the millions of Americans who locked arms, collaborated, innovated, and created this thing that we should all be universally proud of.
So it's interesting, David, because pivoting off of something that Major just said, put up for praise and appreciation. One of the frustrating things as someone who has written about this fairly often myself, and this election denialism, and all of what you talk about in this book, I've seen focus groups where people generally say, oh, let's move past that. Let's not talk about the past. Let's move forward. And what I think you try to do in this book, and why I think it's so important, is you're saying we can't move forward until we understand what occurred and the dangers that lurk in the future.
And the dangers that are happening right now in the present. I mean, Major's exactly right. The 2020 general election was this great American triumph. It came after the primaries, and we all recall during the primaries, we didn't know much about COVID. Election officials were scrambling. The Wisconsin primary was a mess. It happened in the beginning of April. They were doing the best they could. They didn't have any poll workers. Poll workers were quitting. They didn't have any sites to vote because places didn't know if they could have people come in safely. We didn't have a playbook for this at all. And that continued through some of the primaries in the summer. And I was working very closely with election officials all over the country. They rolled up their sleeves and figured it out. And as Major alluded, you can't plan elections socially distant. They're not doing this over Zoom. They're meeting in their offices. That's the only way to do this. And somehow, when we look back on it, election officials managed the highest turnout by any measure in American history. 160 million voters, that's 20 million more votes than had ever been cast in any election. We had 67% turnout. That is by far the highest percentage turnout we've had since, in over a century, since universal suffrage. They didn't have adequate resources at all. Congress did not come through for them. They gave them some money, but not enough. And they did this all in the global pandemic. And their work withstood more scrutiny than we've ever had on any election in history. More pre-election scrutiny, more litigation that occurred that clarified what the rules were. By the way, both sides won some of those. Most of those cases, 7 out of 8, were won by Republicans. And then, of course, more post-election litigation, over 60 cases. And there was never, we sit here today, 698 days from the November 2020 election. There still, to this day, has not been a shred of evidence presented to any court anywhere in the country of any kind of malfeasance or error that would have changed the outcome in any way or come even close. It's really remarkable, and it's the election officials that achieved that, and they have found themselves under constant threats, abuse, harassment in those 700 days since then.
And if I could, John, just ever so briefly, this is kind of personal to me. I grew up in San Diego, California. I was very fortunate that my mother was not only a great mother, but unusually for the 60s and 70s, she was an executive with AT&T. She was an engineer. Not a college-educated engineer, she learned her engineering skills on the job. So I had two parents who left the home every day carrying a briefcase, and I looked up to my mother as a kind of a trailblazer of her time. But my mother took every election day off to work the polls in our neighborhood. It was a house, 3 houses up the hill toward my elementary school. The precinct was a garage. She went in that garage and she sat down and she checked voters in, and she was a poll worker. She said that was her participation in the civic life of America, and it was also, she told me, her way to keep track of the neighborhood. She was a busy person. She had this job. That's how she learned about births, deaths, marriages, all sorts of things going on in the neighborhood. It was how she connected herself, not only to our democratic larger experiment, but the neighborhood in which she worked. In 2020, my eldest daughter became a poll worker for the first time in honor of her grandmother. And so very deeply and personally to me, I wanted to tell this story on behalf of those Americans who did this work, who don't deserve the abuse they've gotten as a result of it, and who did it for all the same reasons. Their participation in the continuance of civic life in America and this, I will say this, small m miracle of participatory democracy.
So what I find interesting about this book, beyond what I've already talked about and how you go in there and there's meticulous reporting and then these scenarios that we'll talk about in a second, is Major and I have known each other for a long, long time. And generally throughout our relationship, Major is the very calm, thoughtful person who's telling me to calm down. And as I was reading this book, I was struck, and I've read your other books, and I know what kind of reporter you are, detached, very, very sober, and in your language. I'm going to show some people some language from this book, and I was struck by it throughout, and it shows how both of you really feel about it. I'm going to put up the first one from page 60 of The Big Truth. We're at a point of maximum peril for our democracy. We are assailing and abusing elections in new and calamitous ways, shifting the battleground from debating persuasion and election to doubts, criticism, and rejectionism after an election. Historically, the blood sport of politics occurred before elections. We now risk blood spilled after them. I'll ask you this, David, since that language really shocked me and will shock a lot of people. And some people will say, come on, all right, we have problems in this country. A lot of people still believe that the 2020 election was rigged, et cetera. But my goodness, blood spilled after them?
I mean, I tend to be somewhat sober in my assessment as well. We share that, and yet the reason we wrote this book is because, I mean, honestly, we're being kept up at night a bit. Like I said, we're almost 700 days since the election. There have been several moments at which, you know, many might have said, oh, this will pass. We'll get over it, it'll be fine. I can tell you, in my nonprofit, I run something called the Election Official Legal Defense Network, where we provide lawyers, pair them up with election officials who need assistance or advice. And I'm very proud to be able to offer that service. It should be shocking that a nonprofit has to offer that service in the United States of America in 2022. And we have seen requests come in for assistance because election officials are being harassed, abused, threatened. Sometimes that abuse is coming from the very county government officials that is supposed to protect them. And what this is leading to over this time, as we see more and more debasement of our democracy by election deniers, which form a pretty significant percentage of the American population right now, and are running for pretty significant offices: governor, secretary of state, attorney general, in some cases, US Senate. And the concern I have is that, and I think Major shares, is that because we are setting ourselves up to believe that any election which our candidates lose in a 50-50 country is stolen. We're being told that. It's predominantly on the right now. I think, you know, as we say in the book, we think the seeds for that exist across the political spectrum. And if we start reducing the guardrails of democracy post-election, that is an environment ripe for political violence. This is not hypothetical. That is literally what happened on January 6th. It was one place, the United States Capitol, on one date, January 6th. Imagine in the future that it could be dozens of places on dozens of dates, as during a period of uncertainty, as the guardrails of democracy are reduced, those who have lost will claim elections are stolen. And once you start believing elections are stolen, you can justify some pretty reprehensible behavior, and we've seen that already.
And I will say that January 6th was galvanizing for David and I for this project, because we wrote those words as a warning. And we wanted a book on the shelves for all Americans to see now, right now, before our next midterm election. We didn't want to wait until the presidential election. We wanted to say these psychic forces, which we describe as dangerous and turbulent, are roiling right now. And we don't need a presidential election for something bad to go wrong, for chaos to develop, confusion, resentments, fistfights, or something worse. There's an aspect of our American political conversation right now that feels very primal, almost existential. If my side loses, all is lost, which is in its own way a kind of reflection about how people feel about the viability of the American experiment. If you believe that if you lose one election, your side loses one election, all is lost, then you're also fundamentally just backing away from the whole idea of what American elections are. And what we say in the book is, win the next election. Do the things necessary to put your issues forward and your agenda forward to win the next election. Don't slander and debase an election you lost simply because you lost it. Because if you do, that will become a tactic universally applied, and every sore loser will doubt every election, and power is only exercised with the validity given to it by the voters in an election. Well, if elections confer no validity, there is no power. And when there's no power and validity, there's only anarchy.
But before getting into the reality of what really happened in 2020 and deconstructing the big lie and presenting some possible steps to ameliorate what's going on, you do present in the book some hypothetical situations that could or might occur. Talk about why you decided to do that, and maybe just describe one of them, Major. Go ahead.
You can start.
So, because we describe this book as a warning, we wanted to offer what a warning looks like. What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And so we create a hypothetical, and it's not a prediction. I want to emphasize again, it is not a prediction. It doesn't have to be. But as David and I talked about how we might approach a hypothetical, we kept basically coming down to the reality that this could happen. And not only did we think it could happen, lots of people in this space, election officials and others, whom we trust and have worked with for many, many years, took a look at it and said, yeah, you're not getting that far away from where we actually are. So here's the scenario for the first chapter. Texas is a big state. It passed a new election law after 2020 that made voting in Texas more restrictive than it already was. In the Texas March primary, that resulted in lots of confusion and very experienced primary voters being disqualified because of the new rules and the new methods. So it's the general election, 2022, just a few weeks away. And Texas is an open carry state. We don't say that's good or bad, it's just the truth. It's an open carry state. And Texas has empowered poll watchers and observers to move around polling areas more than they have been in the past. They're more empowered to inspect things. So we don't say where, we don't say who, we don't describe it in any way except there's a poll worker in a place who is legally carrying a weapon. And this poll worker sees something amiss, and there's a conversation that escalates, becomes louder, then there's some shoving involved. And then, and no one knows exactly how, a gun goes off, and a voter is wounded and dies there in the precinct. And as so much in our current life is, it was captured on video. That video is a viral sensation across the nation. And National Democrats look at this as sort of the apotheosis of everything they have been dreading and fearing for the last 2 years since the 2020 election. A restrictive voting law making it harder for people of color and other minority communities to vote. Someone dies in a precinct. It just seems like such an incredible, unnecessary mess. And grassroots pressure builds on, in our hypothetical, I stress, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. This pressure is intensifying. You've got to do something. You cannot do nothing in the face of this tragedy. So she decides not to seat the entire Texas delegation, which would be an expansion and a very unprecedented application of Speaker powers, but none tested. Both the Republicans and the Democrats aren't seated. Well, because the results in the midterm election are so close, that turns out to determine control of the House of Representatives. So now we don't know who is going to run the House of Representatives in 2023. Texas, which has a newly re-elected governor, Greg Abbott, says, all right, you won't see the delegation? No more tax revenue from Texas. Come and get it. Come and get it. We will no longer cooperate with the federal government and allow any of you to collect revenue. We won't send it in. And if you think you can come get it, try. Like-minded states sympathize with Texas and start doing the same. States sympathetic with Nancy Pelosi began to refuse the rights of travel and commerce with the states that are no longer supporting the federal government with their tax revenue. And slowly, mostly on paper, mostly procedurally, we begin to dissolve all the bonds of commerce, travel, and familiarity this union of states has always had. We call it the Great Cleaving. That's the hypothetical. That is the scenario that might occur. We're not, again, predicting it, calling for it, advocating for it. We're just saying these forces are already present. There are boycotts among states right now over other issues. This is not something that isn't already happening.
But David, Major euphemistically called it the Great Cleaving. What you're talking about is civil war, which has been bandied about already. And there are all kinds of civil war, right, that before it even escalates into violence, which is what you're talking about. You spent a long time in your adult life trying to make sure elections are run properly, that they're secure, that they're accessible, that people want to vote, that they can vote, and that they know that their votes are counted, that there aren't doubts about election. Everything that you've worked for in your professional career essentially is unraveling.
Well, in the perception of it is unraveling. The reality is that we have the most accessible, secure elections in history. And it's in American history for sure, but I would go farther to say American elections are very, very complex. I don't know if everyone understands that. We kind of just know how our elections work, but you have dozens of things on every ballot. Sometimes you have dozens of pages on your ballot. That's not unusual. I used to live in California for a long time. A 10-page ballot is kind of par for the course.
At least.
And so we have very complex elections. Most everywhere else in the world, when they have a democratic election, they might have one race, their member of parliament. They sometimes don't even list the names of the candidates. Sometimes it's just the party. That's the way it works in most other places. We have really complex elections. And yet, especially over the last 2 decades, we have more security, we have more paper ballots than ever before. 95% of all people, including all voters in Nevada, vote on paper ballots, which can then we can go back to and look at them, we can verify them, we can audit them, we can recount them. We have more audits of those ballots than ever before. We have more scrutiny of the entire process. Our voter lists are more accurate than ever before, thanks to better uses of data that states have. And the election officials who run elections are more professional than ever before. A great example of that is Florida. Just 2 decades ago, Florida was an international laughingstock, for good reason. There were a lot of legitimate problems in Florida that a close election exposed. Now Florida is an international model. Did you hear anything about Florida in 2020? They had an election, they had counted all the ballots and disclosed them publicly before 9 p.m. or 9:30 p.m. on election night Eastern time. That's remarkable. That's because of the professionalism that has happened over the last 2 decades. That's the reality. And yet, because losing candidates somehow can't process their defeat, and let's be honest about this as well, the 2020 election was the widest margin of any presidential election in the 21st century where Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot. That's just simple facts. It was 7 million votes in the popular vote. It was a minimum of 3 states in the Electoral College to determine the election. So with all of that, that's the reality. And yet, ultimately, democracy, as much as we adhere to constitutional principles and they're important to us, the Constitution is a piece of parchment. And what's been revealed over the last 700 days is that the democracy relies upon agreement between citizens, kind of an active citizenship, that we're all going to take part in this. And that agreement is breaking down to some degree.
How quaint the notion of hanging chads are now, right,
Exactly.
compared to this. One of the things that you gentlemen talk about in the book, a lot of people, I'd mentioned these focus groups, but you can even see this in polls, say move on beyond the 2020 election. Even January 6th was horrible, but things turned out all right, and Congress got to do its job. But I think one thing that you point out in the book is how close this really could have been to something much, much worse. And you talk about this draft order that was proposed for the DOJ essentially to seize voting machines. Let me show you what you wrote about that. Again, the language is very, very strong here. The draft order can only be described as chilling. It provided for the first time true insight into how close America came to coup d'etat through the armed seizure of ballots, through U.S. soldiers grabbing election equipment on the basis of myths, lies, misconceptions, and a deeply warped interpretation of presidential power, all leading one suspects, to a delay in the transfer of power and ultimately installation of the losing candidate into the White House, a dictatorship in draft form. Dictatorship, Major.
Well, yeah. That's what happens when you falsely interpret your presidential powers, weaponize the military under the guise of a fraudulent Justice Department order to seize ballot box to overturn an election. That's a dictionary definition of a dictatorship, pure and simple. And these powers don't exist. They were imagined out of whole cloth. And yes, the executive order was never put in motion, but it got very high up the chain. And don't just believe the January 6th committee on this, believe the Senate Judiciary Committee. Because before the January 6th committee held its public hearings, the Senate Judiciary Committee investigated this aspect of the 2020 election. And Democrats and Republicans agreed on the underlying fact pattern of this draft executive order. Let me repeat that. Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee agreed with the underlying fact pattern of this draft executive order. They came to different conclusions. Democrats said it was a near coup. Republicans said it was no big deal because ultimately the president didn't do it. And because he didn't do it, no harm, no foul. I will leave it up to this audience to decide for itself what it actually believes. But these facts are not in dispute, not by any stretch of the imagination. They are established, permanent, indelible facts that we came very close to something that I guarantee you I never imagined I would read about as hypothetical American history ever. And we were very close.
One thing that you guys did in this book is you went around the country and you talked to poll workers and you talked to elected officials too, to talk about their experiences and the fragility of democracy in the wake of this. And one of the guys you talked to was a Bucks County, Pennsylvania commissioner. I want to show everybody something he told you. I think if you wanted to destroy democracy, the first thing you do is turn members of that country against each other. The second thing you do is get people to start doubting the validity of the elections that they vote and, engage in. You do those two things and democracy falls apart. On the one hand, David, that is so succinctly put and scary, and yet it's interesting. It's not like this is a real person. It's not like the three of us up on stage who live this stuff 24/7. This is a guy who, yeah, he's in politics, but he recognizes the danger, and you found a lot of that out there in the country.
And one quick thing about Bob Harvey. Before he became what he is in Bucks County, he taught American history to high schoolers for 25 years.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, again, we had some of the interviews in the book. We've talked to dozens, if not hundreds, of election officials. I do all the time. And it does strike me, as I've worked in the space for 25 years, we have seen adversaries, autocracies, China, Russia, et cetera, the Soviet Union before that, try to undermine democratic society's confidence in democracy as a form of government, that democracy cannot deliver. We're seeing China do that now, that only autocracies with strong central government can deliver for its people. That's kind of what central argument of the Chinese Communist Party. And to be honest, over decades, those arguments did not take hold in the United States. We believed in democracy. Sure, we were disappointed when our party or our candidate lost, but we moved on and fought out the next campaign. We are now seeing domestic actors achieve what our foreign adversaries could only dream of, which is dividing us, making us as citizens not view each other as citizens, but instead view each other as the enemy. Internal enemies, our neighbors, our family, our friends as enemies because they differ from us on policy or because they differ from us on which candidate they would like to vote for. And when you get to that point, again, you start to be able to justify some pretty despicable behavior. This is what happened on January 6th. The January 6th insurrectionists did not believe they were supporting dictatorship. They believed an election was stolen because that's what they were told by people they trusted. And those people that they trusted exploited them and continue to exploit them to this day. Tens of millions of Americans who sincerely are disappointed in the outcome of the presidential election. Most of them are not insurrectionists. Most of them are good citizens who disagree with other citizens on policy. They are the targets of a long grift that is giving power to election deniers and also making many people very, very rich at the same time.
Let me just amplify that point, because you stole my thunder a little bit here, but I still want to put up some of the language from the book, and you talked about this on page 95 of The Big Truth. We believe most of the millions of Americans who express doubt about the 2020 election love America, cherish democracy, and believe in the rule of law. We don't believe they have ill intent or seditious motives. They may feel alienated from cultural and demographic trends that may have felt at some level left behind by the digital economy. They may feel a kinship with Trump and fellow Trump supporters that, all other things being equal, makes them wonder what actually happened. And I think you're right to feel sympathy for a lot of folks who don't have, again, don't do this stuff for a living, don't follow it that closely. They have bills to pay, jobs to go to, kids to take care of. So they will believe things they are told by people they believe to be credible. And in this instance, Major, it started at the top with Trump and then trickled down to a lot of what you correctly described throughout the book as grifters trying to make money off of this as well. What worries me is, how do you pierce that? Besides having a copy of this in every home in America, how do you get people to listen? I mean, even on the other side, just real quickly, even on the other side, you talk to a lot of Democrats, you talk to a lot of people on the left. They wouldn't talk this way about the folks that you're talking about. They're all crazy. They're all nuts. They're the people who are unhinged, and we'll never convince them of anything. And so then you have this further polarization because there's no acceptance on either side.
So Michael Jordan famously said, "You miss every shot you don't take." Okay, we have to try. We have to try. And if you go to the acknowledgments at the back of the book, this may sound corny to you, but I really believe it. The first acknowledgement, the first person or thing I thank in my acknowledgement section is America. I thank this country. I've lived an amazing life. I've achieved everything I've ever dreamed of doing in the business I chose to carry out my life's work.
Including being at Indyfest.
Including, actually topped by being at Indyfest. And I believe that this country can get through this particular spasm it is going through right now. And we have to try. And look, I understand, and for those who may think I don't have any understanding for the context around this, I do. Look, I covered the Trump campaign for 16 months from 2015 to 2016. I've attended more than 100 Trump rallies. I've talked to Trump supporters in almost every single one of those rallies. I know there's a heading in the book, a subsection of this book, titled, "Trump voters are pissed off." I understand that. They don't think that the Russia investigation was proper. They think it's borderline criminal. They think that Trump was unnecessarily, uselessly hounded by that. And the origins of it don't stand up well to scrutiny. We describe that. They also think Hunter Biden gets a free pass. We mention that they're aggrieved about that in the book in order to tell them we understand there's a context around this. I understand that sense of grievance. I understand that sense of it doesn't feel fair to us. It feels like our guy always gets the worst end of this conversation. I understand all that, and we put it in the book for a reason, to say that we're not immune to this larger contextual conversation. I'm not. I understand it, or at least I'm doing everything I can, and David is, to try to understand it. What we try to do is appeal to them to say, yes, all that may be true to you. Hold on to that, that's fine. But this other thing isn't true. And you can't counter things you are unhappy with a set of untruths of your own. That's not how it works.
And I just want to say, I mean, although there's parts of this book that are scary, Major and I are both optimists. And I work really closely with Ben Ginsberg, who was George W. Bush's counsel in 2000, 2004, Mitt Romney's counsel in 2012, probably the leading Republican campaign lawyer in the country. He co-chairs the Election Official Legal Defense Network, and he talks about, on the Republican side, saints, sinners, and salvageables. And I think that's a great way of looking at it, because the tens of millions of people who were disappointed in the outcome of the presidential election aren't all the same. They're not a monolith. You know, there are people, and we talk about them in the book, Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors in Arizona, Barbara Sagaski here in Nevada, others who supported the losing presidential candidate, but more importantly stood for country and democracy and did their duty and upheld their oaths. But there are also salvageables. There are also people out there who have questions, and we want to approach them not as if they're crazy, not as if as if they should have voted for Biden, but approach them and engage them, give them a resource that they can look at. One of the tactics that the election deniers use is a whack-a-mole tactic. They keep changing their story and all the time, and when you bat one mole down, another one pops up, and none of them have any validity to them, but it's a constant game. And one of the things we wanted to do was instead tell the positive story that actually confirms that the election was as secure and had as much integrity as possible. And when we do that, hopefully they'll see that there really wasn't anything to
And if you
this.
think about it for just a moment, our most powerful, though unknowing, verifiers are the Republicans elected on state legislative ballot races in 2020 and to Congress. So they're in their positions of power because they were elected, right? And those elections are valid because they're in positions of power, right? On the same ballot, with the same rules and the same counting procedures. So if they're in office and their election is valid, please, 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 on both bended knees, I beg of you, explain to me how your election is valid and only one single part of that ballot was abused or treated fraudulently. And there is no coherent, semi-coherent, partially coherent explanation for that. And they skate away on this because nobody holds them to that one simple question. If you're in power, what is the origin of that? Well, I was elected. Right. Yes, you were. And Republicans on those state legislative ballots outperformed the polls. They did on the federal elections too. And they're in power? That's right.
Yeah, we talk about this in the book. They're literally questioning ballots that gave them the authority to question the ballots. I mean,
that's a trick.
Wrap your mind around that for a second. I mean,
it happened here in Nevada. The Republicans picked up seats in the legislature here in 2020. We have a candidate now running for Secretary of State who says there hasn't been a legitimate election here since 2006, forgetting, of course, that he was elected since 2006. So, but what I'm wondering about, and I guess this is somewhat hypothetical to some extent. This started with Trump, as you mentioned, saying the election was rigged even before the election, and then, of course, amplifying that afterwards. But how much of this might have been asphyxiated if there weren't so many grifters who latched onto this to try to deliver this message to all these people who are, quote unquote, innocent and who are good Americans? Let me show you one other thing from The Big Truth, page 124. All over the country, agitators against Zuckerbucks, ballot mules, and the next conspiracy of the day theory make profit seeking claims they will not and cannot make in court, where inevitably they would have to withstand scrutiny of evidence and procedure. This, in our mind, reveals the essence of the grift: fundamental contempt for the foundation of every pluralistic society, rule of law. David, it's a lot different calling a press conference, as you well know, and then going into court. They lost every lawsuit that they filed after the 2020 election, but they just kept going. Even after that, the grift goes on. The grift will never die, if you will. And they're still doing it. They're still doing it. And boy, probably Dinesh D'Souza's making money off of 2,000 Mules, right?
I mean, he's charging $30 a ticket for that movie. By the way, that movie, which I hope no one has paid to see, it's been widely debunked. It is, it wouldn't take us that long to debunk it fully, but it's already been done, but you can find good evidence of that. There have been 2 states, Republican law enforcement officials in 2 states, Georgia and Arizona, have asked the makers of that movie for all evidence documenting any malfeasance that they think violated the law. One state actually issued a subpoena for that evidence, and to this day, there has been zero evidence that has been offered by anyone. It is really easy to go on social media and say, we've got a mind-blowing lawsuit that's about to be filed. You know, for instance, someone who makes bedding might be doing that even as we speak. It's very easy to have rallies and sell tickets to those rallies, sell streaming to that. There's better places to buy tickets for streaming events like this one. And keep promising, like the charlatan preacher who says the end of the world is coming, get your affairs in order. Keep promising it happens, and every time the date passes, what do? They come up with another date in the future, right? It's always coming. Well, we're 700 days past the election. Where is the evidence? They went before 60-plus courts. They went before 8 Trump-appointed judges. They went to the United States Supreme Court. We had more litigation than ever before, and the work of election officials in this country withstood that scrutiny every single time. There is simply no other way to put this. There is zero evidence of any significant problems in the 2020 election, and as Major put it, that is a little m miracle, because that was one of the hardest elections we've ever had to run in this country.
I'm wondering, Major, what you think in terms of the perceived or real, and maybe both, weakness of the current president, Joe Biden, and how that is either caused by this phenomenon that we're talking about, or it exacerbates it and makes the danger much worse because he is perceived as so weak.
So I understand that many Trump supporters can't believe that Biden is president. They don't like that Biden is president. They consider his agenda borderline ruinous for the country. All of that exists within the legitimate space of political conversation in this country. And it dates back to a memory I have of a bumper sticker, the first political bumper sticker I ever remember seeing in the early 70s. Don't blame me, I voted for McGovern.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
You know? I voted for the other guy, I'm so angry I can barely see straight. And there's this other companion thing, well, I don't know anyone who voted for Biden, so he couldn't have won. Well, that was also said about Nixon in '72 by a very famous New York writer. None of my friends voted for Nixon, how could he be president? Well, it happens that way, folks. But the sort of unbelievability of the Biden president exacerbates this. And there's also something else that's much more subtle. Because the former president will not get off this hobby horse, this malevolent lie about the election he fairly and squarely lost, Republicans feel they can't either. And I've had this conversation with more Republicans than I care to count. I can't argue with people who already believe this. My people believe this, therefore I must act accordingly. To which I say, no, you actually have a responsibility as a leader to say, no, on this you're wrong, and we need to move on to other issues. No, they feel they can't. And, as David just mentioned, one of the fastest ways in Republican Party politics right now to gain attention and fundraising on social media, and they're completely very tightly aligned, is to deny the election. The fastest way to gain notoriety and legitimacy. It's also become a good housekeeping seal of how authentic and believable a Trump supporter you actually are. It's a proxy. Are you a legit Trump supporter or not? Well, do you believe it was stolen? Yes, I do. Okay, you're in the club. It's become a means by which all sorts of other things are understood under this umbrella. And we would argue that's not necessary to keep the Trump movement alive. You don't need that to be for tariffs against China and a different approach to crime or immigration or taxes. You don't need any of that. Actually, if you cling to this one big lie, you're going to hurt your party. It's happening in Senate races all across the country in the midterms. And you're not going to get to those other issues because you're electing primary winners who are non-competitive or not as competitive in general elections. Look at New Hampshire and Arizona as classic examples of that. Chris Sununu would have run in New Hampshire if he knew he didn't have to go through a Republican primary in which the Stop the Steal thing would be wrapped around his neck. Same thing with Doug Ducey in Arizona. If Doug Ducey and Chris Sununu were the Republican nominees in both those races, I guarantee you the polling would be different. They would be more likely to win those races. So I say to Republicans, if for no other reason than the practical application of the agenda you care about and the need to elect people to carry it out in Washington, Get off this. It's injurious to the country, and oh, by the way, it's injurious to your own party's self-interest.
You know, it's interesting, Major, and I don't think my gray matter is totally atrophied. I think you're quoting Pauline Kael as having said
Yes.
that about Nixon. Pauline Kael, in case you don't know, is one of the most respected film reviewers in the history.
Yes,
She's
exactly.
a very, very smart woman, David. That's what frightens me the most about some of these deniers. These are not just all people who are clueless or dumb, have sub-triple-digit IQs. There are people who actually, I mean, people I know who are smart people. They're businessmen, they're businesswomen, they're well-educated people, and they believe this stuff. And they will do the whack-a-mole thing too, David. They will change the subject to something else if you deconstruct one part of it. That to me is much more dangerous, that smart people believe this.
And there's, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's media silos that we all live in. There's an incentive structure that's very out of whack right now, where those who are lying are getting rich, and those who are telling the truth, like Liz Cheney, are losing their jobs. That's an out of whack incentive structure. But you're exactly right. I mean, you'll hear this all the time. Well, you know, Trump had all these rallies, and Biden didn't have any. So how could Biden have won? Well, rally attendances are not votes. You know, all the people I know in my neighborhood voted for Trump. Well, we're becoming a little more segregated in where we live. All the people on my Facebook page voted for Trump. Well, we're doing that in social media too. And then they'll start grasping at things because there is probably something in their brain that recognizes there's some cognitive dissonance about this. So they need to be fed the bamboo ballots. They need to be fed the suitcase of ballots in Fulton County. They need to be fed the lie that observers were not present in the counting areas. They need to be fed the lie about a certain voting system vendor. They need, even though we have paper ballots, and we actually went back and counted those ballots by hand in many cases and audited them, so we know what happened. They need to be fed that so they can make they can resolve that cognitive dissonance. I don't know what's going to happen here. We do talk about some solutions, but we'll be the first to admit there is no magic wand here. The damage that has taken place over the last, I say 700 days, but actually, as we talk about in the book, this predated that. The damage that has happened over the last several years, this is going to take years, if not decades, to fix.
And I would say to your example of people that you encountered, I do think there is a blurring of satisfaction, dissatisfaction, election stolen or not. They don't really mean stolen. They don't mean actually stolen. This means they're unhappy with it. And I would urge those in that category, I'm going to use a word that Abraham Lincoln used to use a lot, disenthrall yourselves from this idea that the election was stolen and separate that reality. Was it a legitimate election? One we should actually praise as an example of American collaboration, innovation, cooperation, and success. And then focus on the things that you think politically are awry, askew, or flat out wrong with the Biden administration. Disenthrall yourself from this particularly poisonous notion that elections can be stolen. They can't. We take a conspiracy of unimaginable intricacy, because our elections, you should know, are decentralized, one of the most decentralized things we do in our country. And this one wasn't.
You know, I think this is, David mentioned media silos, and for years I've been writing about, even well before this, the validation culture that exists out there. Conservatives will watch Fox News and that's it, and they'll get all their quote-unquote news from Fox, and same with liberals and MSNBC. And so, okay, so you watch Fox, you're going to want to vote for the Republican. You watch MSNBC, you're going to want to. And so, but this is the natural progression of that, right? And that you're only getting that. And so, how do you get people to be curious again, right? This is one of the greatest frustrations to me, is that we are in the age of the greatest information available in the history of the universe, but we're also in the age of the greatest misinformation, disinformation available. And to get people to be interested in this stuff, when they stay in their silos, when they just want to validate their preconceived beliefs, that's really hard.
I mean, I think it is. I actually think, and you didn't pay me to say this, but the Nevada Independent, other entities like that, like the Texas Tribune and others that provide really detailed, comprehensive, unbiased news coverage are really important to that. But many people don't want to be challenged. Many people want to be validated. Our lives are very complicated, and it's hard to be challenged sometimes. And if you read the book, and Major and I are proud of this, there's a lot for people across the political spectrum to not like in this book. We talk about quite a bit, although the damage being done to democracy is overwhelmingly, predominantly coming from the extreme right now. The seeds of it are in the left as well. It's across the political spectrum. It is not 50-50. It is not moral equivalence at all. But we have to acknowledge it's not 100-0. It might be 99-1. It might be, and also everyone who is conservative or Republican is not an election denier. Many of the most courageous people who've worked in the last 2 years are Republicans, as we talk about quite a bit. But there are scenarios whereby election denial could just become another tactic in the political battles that we have. And if we think that, oh, well, one side will never adopt that tactic if it's winning, I think we're kidding ourselves. Because eventually they might have to in order to compete on an even playing field.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about that, Major, because since he mentioned, the seeds on the left, I still talk, and they don't talk nicely to me, by the way, to Bernie Sanders supporters who insist that the election was stolen, the primary was stolen from him after WikiLeaks, and then all the stuff the DNC wrote, and there are a lot of stuff happened in Nevada that, frankly, I never want to revisit, but they believe that, and you feel that this could easily happen on the other side when you have the intolerance and the you can't get through to people because they don't want to listen to you anymore, and they've decided, based on one little piece of evidence or two or three, that the election was stolen.
John, you know this as well as I do. There's an old saying in politics. It's easier to fool people than to persuade them that they've been fooled. It's really true. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to fool people than it is to persuade them that they've been, oh my God, I've been fooled, I feel so dumb, I don't want to get to that place. And look, particularly in nominating contests, rules are precise, and those who understand and execute their battle plan to those rules more often than not prevail. I mentioned McGovern earlier. The reason he was the nominee is because he wrote the rules in the convention before the 72 time when he got the nomination. Therefore, he knew the rules. Barack Obama, when he challenged Hillary Clinton, said, she's going to win more primaries than me, so I need to win every caucus. Right. He did, and he got the delegates from the caucuses while Hillary Clinton slept, literally on those caucuses. Those are the rules. You may not think they're actually fair or representative, but they're the rules. And the rules are there to guide campaigns to strategize to win. That's the whole process. And yes, some Sanders supporters still think there was problems with that and that things got off the rails. There was a very good article in the Washington Post this week about Stacey Abrams in Georgia and her evolving sort of rhetorical twisting over and over about whether she won or lost the governor's race in 2018. And one of the reasons she's trailing Brian Kemp now is because a lot of Georgia voters have decided that's all she really has to offer. This grievance about an election that she lost and doesn't want to concede or doesn't want to describe it as the way she should have. Hard-fought campaign, things were changed, but she came up short, and she's going to win the next one. That's a problem that leadership calls upon you to resolve for yourself and for those whom you intend to lead. That's one of the obligations of leadership.
And I really think it's hurt, even though a lot of what Stacey Abrams has done in trying to reform was hurt by the fact that she did specifically say this election was stolen from me, and that now she's trying to smooth that over. That's absolutely right. And by the way, Hillary Clinton won the caucus here 50% to 45% against Obama, but Obama got more delegates because he took the time to understand how the caucus will work.
And if I may, for just really quickly, I mean, there is You know what? I totally forgot my point. Go ahead.
Well, I still want to. We have about 5 minutes left, David, and I want to ask you about some of the rays of sunshine that you two optimists bring in at the end of the book. That there are ways to try to fix or ameliorate this. You can hold up the book if you'd like, Major. And you talk about things like something that most normal people had never heard of before the 2020 election in January 6th, the Electoral Count Act. But you talk about a lot of different things. Talk about some of those and what you think the most important things that you wrote about were.
Electoral Count Act reform is important, not because it changes the law. There's no constitutional cheat code that allows the Vice President of the United States to just decide who the president's going to be. Certainly Vice President Gore in 2001 and Vice President Nixon in 1961 knew that. But it is important to clarify the rules further so that no one attempts to do what then President Trump tried to do in 2000 and 2001. And what Electoral Count Act reform, there have been bills that are moving in both houses right now. They're slightly different, but they generally do the same thing. One, they make clear that the Vice President's role is ceremonial. He is just presiding over a ceremony that we already know the outcome of, by the way. That the thresholds for objection to the electoral votes are raised so that 2 members of Congress can't derail the joint session. It now has to be dozens of members of Congress, depending upon what happens. It also expedites any litigation over legitimate issues surrounding those electoral votes. And there have been times when there have been legitimate issues. There were dueling slates from Hawaii in 1960, for instance. It's rare, but it happens. So that's very important. I think one of the other things that I've really focused on quite a bit, and up until recently I wasn't very optimistic about, but I'm getting more optimistic about, is I talked about the out-of-whack incentive structure. And I think one way to restore the incentive structure to where it should be is to hold those who have been engaged in an active campaign against our democratic principles accountable for their crimes, hold them civilly liable where appropriate. And now with investigations coming out of the Department of Justice and out of Fulton County, Georgia, with the January 6 committee's hearings and investigations, with civil lawsuits being waged against media organizations and Mike Lindell, with bar complaints being filed against lawyers, there's a reason that Donald Trump might go on Truth Social and say that I declassified all these documents because I magically thought about that in my mind, but his lawyers won't say that in court. And that is because they know they will be disbarred if they make a misrepresentation to the court. So we're starting to see this accountability come about. We have a long ways to go, but hopefully that will restore the incentive structure.
Major, I want to kind of wrap up this discussion with something that I acknowledge is very important to me personally as the CEO of a news organization, but none of what you hope will happen is going to happen unless journalism, to some extent, and journalists help make this case. You and I came up at a time when it was he said, she said, be fair, just give the other side its say. There aren't 2 sides to every story. There are not 2 sides to this story. How do journalists cover this and do it fairly, but actually present the truth? Doesn't different kinds of, I'm not saying the kind of language that you're able to use in the book, but I think we have to use different kinds of language now.
Well, facts are facts. Truth is truth. Revealed, verifiable truth is reportable as precisely that. You don't have to other sides facts that are permanent. And the count of the election of 2020 is an immovable and irremovable truth. It will persist. And it will outlast all the deniers, and that's one thing that gives me hope. And the Nevada Independent, most news organizations of size and scope and ambition have created democracy desks, or desks that monitor election procedures in their states or their jurisdictions in ways they didn't even 3 years ago. There is now a very heightened awareness and a process by which to evaluate and monitor every step of this election season in the midterm elections and the presidential election. There is visibility, there is light, and it is, as a Supreme Court justice whose name eludes me right now said, a great disinfectant. Visibility and light disinfects. It shows what's happening. And that process is going on. It's aggressive and ambitious at the Nevada Independent. It's aggressive and ambitious at a lot of news organizations across the country, not just the biggest ones. So that also gives me hope. And we don't have to both sides this. These are the processes. This is where you vote. This is the count. Here are the machines. There's the paper. There's the audit. There's the truth. End.
Gentlemen, I was not exaggerating. This is a very, very important book. It is a monumental achievement. I know how passionate both of you are about this. I appreciate your taking the time to come here and talk about it. I hope everyone who is here and watching on the live stream and many, many, many more will read the book.
We have one punchline for the book, if I could. Survive Thanksgiving.
Yeah, right, exactly. Major Garrett and David Becker, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
That's it for today on Indyfest 2022. Got a big day tomorrow, though. For those of you who are coming in person, we have brunch that's starting early. I think around 8:30 or 9. I forget. Get here, we'll feed you. Otherwise, if you're just going to watch the proceedings, we have a pre-debate focus group at 9:30. Then Joe Lombardo and Steve Sisolak are going to have to put up with me for quite some time, which is, we'll see what good mood they're in by the end of that. And then afterwards, we're going to repeat the focus groups to see if it changed any mind. And then after that, our exclusive poll results on the governor's race, the Senate race, and all of the statewide races in Nevada and much more. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. Those of you who are here right now for Indyfest 2022, we'll see you tomorrow.